Slaughterhouse-Five is the story written by Kurt Vonnegut of Billy Pilgrim told in first person from the perspective of our narrator, who is not Billy Pilgrim. Billy Pilgrim is suffering from pretty bad PTSD after living through the bombing of Dresden and the end of World War II. Kurt Vonnegut and our narrator actually did live through the bombing of Dresden, and our narrator seems to be Kurt Vonnegut's representation here. Billy's motives are kind of unclear, but his story is told from various points in his own timeline of life, because pretty early in the story he becomes unstuck in time and jumps around from memory to memory, and so he knows his own story even in the beginning. His timeline, when you lay it out, goes something like this. In 1922, he was born in upstate New York, and when we meet him in 1944, he is an optometry school student who has been drafted for the war. He's sent to the Battle of the Bulge, but gets lost behind enemy lines, and he kind of falls in with this guy, Roland Weary, who is very bullying, and he likes to kill things, and he's only 18 years old. This is pretty much where he becomes unstuck at time, and then he gets taken prisoner, inevitably, by the Germans, and he's sent to a prisoner of war compound inside the German border, but Roland Weary dies of gangrene on the way because when they captured him, they took his boots. At the compound, Billy meets Paul Lazarro and Edgar Derby, and Lazarro swears vengeance on Billy Pilgrim for Roland Weary's life because they were friends. And Edgar Derby is kind of this old school teacher who was drafted, or who volunteered to get into the war. Billy and Edgar Derby are sent on to Dresden to live in this abandoned slaughterhouse with their comrades, Slaughterhouse No. 5, and that's where the title of the book comes from. Billy and Edgar both survived the Dresden bombing by American and British forces. And Derby is later assassinated or killed by firing squad for stealing spoils of war in the form of a teapot from the ruins of Dresden. After the war ends, Billy is sent home, where he has a nervous breakdown, and eventually he finishes his optometry degree and marries Valencia, but he has this nervous breakdown, and he starts reading these science fiction novels from the guy who was next to him in the vet hospital where he went. He recovers, though, and he marries Valencia, and they have 2 kids, and they settle down, and he starts making lots of money in his profession as an optometrist. On the way in 1968 to a convention for optometry, he gets on this plane that he knows is going to crash, but he can't say anything or do anything about it. So he gets on the plane, and he and one of the co-pilots were the only survivors of the crash, but Billy gets this terrible skull fracture and ends up in a hospital. And on the way to meet him, Valencia, his wife, gets into a car crash, but continues driving afterwards, and she dies of carbon monoxide poisoning. He retreats back into his own head in the hospital as he's recovering, but he's thinking about this time where he is abducted by these aliens, the Tralfamadorians. And the Tralfamadorians exist in this timescape that encompasses all of time. They don't just see linearly like we do. They don't live moment to moment. They live in all of it at once. And so he's thinking about this while he's in the hospital. Eventually he gets out, and he goes to New York City. Before the skull fracture, before his surgery, he wasn't very vocal about his getting abducted by aliens. But afterwards, he was very vocal about it, and he decides that he's going to tell the world about his experiences. And a lot of the Tralfamadorian stuff, I think, is influenced by the science fiction novels that he read. By the author Kilgore Trout, who's a fictional author, but is kind of important to the story. Every individual moment in time for Billy is just a part of his fate, which he has to accept. So there's this whole theme of there's no free will. You just have to accept your own fate. And the past, the present, and the future are all illusions so that we can get through our lives. But we exist in all of it. So, because the future can't be changed, we don't have free will, we don't have the control. And so Billy decides to tell the world about this. But his daughter Barbara, who ends up being kind of his caretaker, tries to put a stop to it. And this is why she is kind of the conflict of Billy's story. Billy is pretty anti-conflict overall, but she is pretty much his only source of character conflict, other than the people who, in his story in the war, who presented conflict directly to him. Even then, though, he was so anti-conflict, he didn't want to deal with it. He just wanted to get through to the end. The events and the setting are really important because they provide this scope of understanding the story's structure. The Tralfamadorians have their own version of a novel, and their own version of a novel is this, essentially all of this information given to you at once, and it's structured that way so that they can get this glimpse into what life is like. And the novel Slaughterhouse-Five is kind of set up like that, and I think that's really important to know as far as Kurt Vonnegut's writing style, is that he sets this up specifically like that so that it gives us this glimpse into Billy Pilgrim's life. And Billy Pilgrim's, he has all of these radical stories, maybe because he was very disappointed with his own reality. He has all of these influences, the science fiction novels in particular, that fuel his imagination and fuel the post-traumatic stress disorder to come out in these ways. And I think that's also really important to acknowledge. I think the main climax of the story would be where Billy is in the hospital and Valencia is trying to get to him, but she dies. Because that's this huge moment where he becomes vocal about his experience being abducted by aliens. It's representative of a time when Billy kind of shuts down and really processes his own life. A favorite passage is on page 20, and it goes, "The time would not pass. Somebody was playing with the clocks, and not only with the electric clocks, but the wind-up kind, too. The second hand on my watch would twitch once, and a year would pass, and then it would twitch again. There was nothing I could do about it. As an earthling, I had to believe whatever the clocks said, and calendars." And that is from where it's actually the narrator's point of view in the first chapter. And it shows us the parallels between the narrator and Kurt Vonnegut and Billy Pilgrim. And a second favorite passage is page 135, where Billy is examining a boy's eyes as an optometrist. And he says, While he examined the boy's eyes, Billy told him matter-of-factly about his adventures on Tralfamadore, assured the fatherless boy that his father was very much alive still in moments the boy would see again and again. "Isn't that comforting?" Billy asked, and somewhere in there the boy's mother went out and told the receptionist that Billy was evidently going crazy. Billy was taken home. His daughter asked him again, "Father, father, father, what are we going to do with you?" And that really shows this kind of turning point in Billy's understanding of the world around him, and I think that's also kind of important to acknowledge. Ultimately, Billy is surrounded by all of this death. In the bombing of Dresden, over 100,000 people died, and people die all throughout the story, and in response to each one, he says, quote unquote, "so it goes." And it's this story of somebody who has accepted their own fate, and who continually accepts the fate of those around him, and something that we cannot change. And I think it's a wonderful story about post-traumatic stress disorder and war and peace and human existence, and it was definitely worth reading.